The final gate of Castelnuovo had been sealed. Francisco de Sarmiento was trapped outside with his last remaining Spanish soldiers. Before them, thousands of Ottoman troops were flooding the ruined streets. Behind them, there was no way back. Initially, this fortress had only about 3,500 defenders. But out there were 50,000 Ottoman soldiers, over 200 warships, siege cannons, and the elite Janissary forces. From the wall above, a rope was dropped down. Someone shouted, "Commander, climb up! We will pull you in." Sarmiento looked at the rope. Then he looked at the soldiers standing around him. He didn't climb. He drew his sword, turned to face the Ottomans, and chose to stay. Castelnuovo would ultimately fall, but before its collapse, those 3,500 men turned a certain defeat into one of the most haunting last stands of the 16th century. What made 3,500 Spanish soldiers strike fear into the most powerful empire in the world at the time, even when victory was already assured for them? Let's step back to 1539 to understand why a small place like Castelnuovo forced the Ottomans to deploy such a massive force. The 16th century was an era of a burning Mediterranean. To the east and south, the Ottoman Empire was at its peak. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent not only controlled a vast territory across the Middle East and the Balkans, but he also relentlessly pressured Central Europe. By land, the Ottomans had marched all the way to Vienna in 1529. By sea, they had Barbarossa. Barbarossa was one of the most terrifying figures in the Mediterranean at the time. He wasn't just an admiral, he was the very symbol of Ottoman naval supremacy. On the other side was the Christian world of Europe. But Europe wasn't a unified bloc. Spain had its own interests. Venice had its own interests. The Pope had his own interests. The Holy Roman Empire had its own interests. They might all fear the Ottomans, but they weren't always willing to bleed for one another. In 1538, the Holy League was formed to counter the Ottomans. But the Battle of Preveza shattered many hopes. The Allied fleet fell to Barbarossa, allowing the Ottomans to solidify their dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Castelnuovo had been captured earlier by Christian forces and entrusted to the Spanish to hold. In theory, this was a stepping stone. From here, they could threaten coastal routes, put pressure on Ottoman territories, and prove that the Christian alliance was still capable of a counteroffensive. In reality, however, after Preveza, Castelnuovo was abandoned. It was left behind like a chess piece stranded in the middle of the board. Too important for the Ottomans to ignore, but too isolated for Europe to save. That was the tragedy of the 3,500 men inside. They didn't lose because they were poor fighters. They lost because the board was rigged against them before the very first cannon was even fired. Before the official general assault began, there was a skirmish that made the Ottomans realize their opponents wouldn't be easily choked out. An Ottoman force landed near Castelnuovo, about 1,000 men aiming to find water, scout the terrain, and take prisoners for intelligence. For an army of 50,000, 1,000 men was just a small detachment. But for the 3,500 men in the fortress, 1,000 men was nearly a third of their entire defensive force. If Sarmiento sent too many men out, the fortress would be vulnerable. If he sent no one, the Ottomans would be free to survey, seize positions, and gather intel. He chose to attack. Several Spanish companies, along with light cavalry, launched a surprise attack on the landing party. This wasn't a scene of two armies lining up beautifully like in a painting. It was a chaotic brawl near the shoreline. Sand, rocks, dust, crashing waves, the crack of matchlocks, the screams of men. The Ottomans tried to hold their formation to avoid being pushed into the water. The Spanish hit fast and close, giving the enemy no time to regroup. One Ottoman group was cut off from the shore. Another scrambled to retreat to their boats. Some fell into the water in full armor and never resurfaced. Ultimately, the Ottoman force had to retreat. According to some accounts, hundreds of Ottomans were killed or captured in these initial clashes. Strategically, it wasn't a decisive victory. But psychologically, it was massive. It told the Ottomans one thing. The men inside Castelnuovo weren't going to sit around waiting to die. They would rush out and bite back whenever they got the chance. And for Barbarossa, that was a troubling sign. A besieged fortress that still dared to counterattack was a fortress whose spirit hadn't broken. To win, he had to crush it. Not just with cannons, but with blood. The day the first general assault began, the atmosphere around Castelnuovo shifted. From early morning, there were unusual movements on the Ottoman side. The drums beat more steadily. Banners were raised. Units massed before the heavily damaged sections of the wall. The artillery kept firing, but no longer just to breach the walls. It fired to cover the advancing infantry. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops began to move. The Janissary units marched in disciplined formations, much calmer than the regular infantry. On the walls, Sarmiento ordered his men to hold. Don't fire too early, because ammo was scarce. Every shot had to count. The Ottomans drew closer. 100 meters, 80 meters, 50 meters. Arrows began arcing over the ramparts. Matchlock fire from the Ottomans zipped back. A Spanish soldier dropped, his hand still gripping the burning match cord of his gun. The man next to him pulled his body aside, picked up the gun, and kept waiting. 30 meters. 20 meters. Then the order rang out. Fire! A volley of matchlocks erupted along the wall. White smoke billowed out. The first Ottoman ranks collapsed. But the ranks behind them didn't stop. They stepped over their fallen comrades and kept pushing. Ladders were raised. Hooks bit into stone. The Ottomans swarmed up. And as the first men set foot on the battlements, they were met by Spanish pikes. At the breaches, the fighting was even more brutal. Because there were no high walls left to separate them. Ottoman forces poured through the heaps of rubble. The Spanish Tercios formed upright behind the gaps. The front row anchored their pikes into the dirt. The back rows readied their guns. When the Ottomans charged in, they slammed into a wall of steel. The first man was skewered. The second was shot. The third slipped on blood. The fourth managed to hack a Spanish soldier, only to catch a dagger in the ribs a second later. The space was too tight. 50,000 Ottoman troops couldn't leverage all their might at once. That was exactly what Sarmiento wanted. He turned the enemy's numerical superiority into a long, single-file march into a slaughterhouse. But the toll on the Spanish was immense. Every time they held a breach, they lost dozens of men. Every time an officer was wounded, the line wavered. The assault lasted for hours. Then came another wave. Then another. The Ottomans pulled back to let the cannons roar again. Then they surged forward once more. By the end of the day, the ground before Castelnuovo was carpeted with the dead. The Ottomans hadn't taken the fortress. But the Spanish also understood a chilling truth. They had won a single day. Not the war. Because the Ottomans could attack again tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. While Castelnuovo could not resurrect its dead. After the first assault, many Ottomans believed the defenders were exhausted. It made sense. A tiny force had just weathered back-to-back charges from an army more than 10 times their size. They lost men. They lost ammo. They lost sleep. The walls were heavily battered. But just when the enemy thought they were spent, Sarmiento chose to do the most audacious thing possible. Counterattack. Not a massive breakout charge. That was impossible. But a short, sharp raid, striking the Ottoman camp to sow chaos, shatter morale, and show the enemy that Castelnuovo still had its fangs. A detachment of Spanish soldiers was selected. Records say a few hundred men took part in this daring night raid. They opened the gates under the cover of darkness. No drums. No horns. No battle cries. Just the sound of footsteps on the damp earth. They crawled, ran low, and crossed the dark no-man's land between the fortress and the enemy camp. The first Ottoman sentries were taken out in silence. Then the first fire was lit. A tent went up in flames. Then a second. Then a whole row of tents. Horses panicked and neighed wildly. Ottoman soldiers jolted awake in the dead of night, many before they could even don their armor or grasp what was happening. In the pitch black, a small group of Spanish soldiers could seem like a massive army. Screams spread from one camp sector to another. Some thought the garrison was breaking out. Some thought the Christian fleet had arrived. Some ran blindly into their own formations. The panic spread faster than the fire. Some accounts even claim the chaos reached near Barbarossa's personal quarters, forcing his guards to evacuate him to a safer area, despite his protests. While this detail might be colored with a touch of heroism, it reflects a very real truth. The raid struck the very nerve of the Ottoman army. It didn't shift the balance of power. The next morning, the 50,000 Ottomans were still there. The 200-plus warships still locked down the sea. Castelnuovo was still besieged. But from that night on, the Ottomans knew they weren't besieging a bunch of men waiting to die. They were besieging men ready to drag as many enemies to hell as possible before they fell. For Sarmiento, it was a psychological victory. For Barbarossa, it was a reason to end things faster. In the days that followed, the battlefield of Castelnuovo became a brutal loop. Cannons fired. Walls crumbled. Ottomans charged. Spanish repelled them. Night fell. Spanish patched the walls. Next morning, cannons fired again. Just like that, the city was worn down layer by layer. But it wasn't just the stone being ground down. It was the men, too. Rations began to run low. Clean water dwindled. The wounded packed the churches, basements, and hallways. There weren't enough medics. Not enough bandages. Not enough wine to clean the wounds. Many didn't die from the initial blade stroke, but from infection, from fever, from blood loss, from lying too long amidst the stench of gunpowder and corpses. Some lightly wounded soldiers returned to the walls after a few hours, because there was no one left to replace them. Men wrapped rags tightly around their stomachs to keep their guts from spilling out, then grabbed their pikes and fell back into line. It sounds unbelievable, but in sieges like this, the line between still fit to fight and already dead is razor thin. As long as a man could stand, he was needed. This was when the disparity between 3,500 and 50,000 became its most ruthless. On day one, the ratio was roughly 1 to 14. But after several assaults, if the Spanish had only 2,000 combat-effective men left, the ratio became 1 to 25. If 1,000 men were left, it was 1 to 50. If 600 were left, it was nearly 1 to over 80. Towards the end, each Spaniard wasn't just holding his own position. He had to hold the positions of the dead. A wall section once defended by 50 men might now have only 20. A cannon that once had a full crew now had only 2 men desperately pivoting the barrel by hand. A breach once plugged by 3 rows of pikes now had only 1 thin line. Meanwhile, the Ottomans could rotate their troops. When one unit tired, another stepped up. When one wave failed, the next followed. 1,000 dead was a heavy loss, but not enough to halt a 50,000 strong army. That is the difference between an isolated fortress and an empire. Castelnuovo wasn't defeated in a single moment. It was ground down. Stone by stone. Bullet by bullet. Man by man. After days of bloodletting, Barbarossa offered terms of surrender once more. This time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a final lifeline. From the Ottoman perspective, this made perfect sense. They were winning. But the victory was too costly. Every meter of wall taken had to be bought with corpses. Every charge bled the Ottoman ranks of highly trained soldiers, including janissaries. Barbarossa didn't want to turn a minor fortress into a bottomless pit for his army. He wanted Castelnuovo. It didn't necessarily have to be a Castelnuovo carpeted in Ottoman dead. The message sent into the fort: you have fought enough. Surrender. You can live. You can keep your honor. You can walk away. For the men inside Castelnuovo, this offer surely wasn't easy to brush off. Put yourself in their boots. You've lived through weeks of hell. You know your friends are dead. You know the ammo is running out. You know the walls won't hold much longer. You know there are 50,000 troops outside. And now the enemy is handing you a way out. Just lay down your weapons. Just open the gates. Just accept that the mission has failed. Perhaps some wavered. That wouldn't make them cowards. It's just a human reaction. But the final decision was still no surrender. Not because they thought they would win, but because they believed surrendering now would render all the previous deaths meaningless. If they had sacrificed thousands of men to hold Castelnuovo day by day, then the final day had to be held with that exact same spirit. Sarmiento and his officers chose to fight on. And from that moment, every man inside understood they were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting so that their deaths would carry weight. Within Castelnuovo's defense grid, there was a crucial sector in the upper town. Barbarossa realized that if he took this high ground, the entire Spanish defensive posture would be torn wide open. So, the Ottoman artillery focused its fury there. Day after day, the cannons pounded the exact same target. Walls cracked. Towers collapsed. Gun emplacements were smashed. Structures that were once defensive assets turned into hazardous heaps of rubble for the defenders themselves. Sarmiento knew this spot was the key. He funneled more men in to hold it. Pulled the wounded out, if they could even be moved. Stationed his most hardened officers there. One standout figure in this clash was Machen de Munguia, a Spanish officer remembered for fighting with ferocious grit during these brutal hours. When the Ottomans launched their assault on this nearly obliterated fortress, the battle raged from dawn till dusk. There was no longer a high wall where men below climbed and men above pushed back. Now, both sides fought amidst the ruins. A collapsed wall created a slope of shattered stone. The Ottomans surged up that slope. The Spanish stood at the crest, thrusting down with pikes. When the pikes snapped, they used swords. When swords got wedged in enemy armor, they used daggers. Certain positions traded hands multiple times in a single day. The Ottomans would take a rocky redoubt. The Spanish would counterattack and take it back. Then Ottoman cannons would shell that exact spot, ignoring their own troops nearby, because the objective outweighed the lives of the men who had just scaled it. This was a brutal hallmark of siege warfare in that era. When infantry and artillery strike a single point, the casualties don't just come from the enemy. They come from your own friendly fire, too. But the Ottomans had the manpower to absorb that. The Spanish did not. By the end of the day, the upper fortress became practically impossible to hold. The survivors pulled back to the secondary lines, dragging the wounded with them if they still could. Many officers died where they stood. A very small number were captured. And among those captured, deserters or prisoners told Barbarossa exactly what he wanted to hear. The Spanish were exhausted. They were out of gunpowder, out of bullets, riddled with injuries. The number of combat-capable men left was microscopic. To Barbarossa, this was the signal. Just one more push. Castelnuovo would break. On August 5th, the Ottomans renewed the attack. Janissaries were thrown into the fray. Even the cavalry had to dismount to join the siege, because in a shattered city, horses were of little use. Ottoman troops swarmed the walls, the breaches, the narrow alleys. But miraculously, the Spanish still drove them back. Not because they were stronger. Not because they had more men. But because the avenues into the city were still narrow enough for courage and discipline to make a difference. A wall tower might fall to the Ottomans, but the city wasn't lost yet. A breach might be overrun, but the secondary line still held. That was how Castelnuovo prolonged its life. Not by trying to hold everything forever, but by retreating layer by layer, biting off chunks of the enemy, making them pay in blood for every step. But then night fell, and the rain started to pour. To an ordinary person, rain is a relief from the dust and smoke. To the defenders of Castelnuovo, rain was a disaster. Because matchlock firearms of that era relied on a slow-burning match cord and gunpowder, mechanisms highly vulnerable to moisture. The rain made the match cord sputter and die. It made the gunpowder clump. It rendered their already dwindling arsenal of guns useless or wildly unreliable. The remaining cannons were also starved of shot and powder. That meant if the Ottomans attacked the next morning, the Spanish likely wouldn't have the heavy firepower to stop them from afar. They would have to fight close quarters, with pikes, with swords, with daggers, with rocks, with bare hands if necessary. That night, perhaps many inside the fortress understood tomorrow was the final day. No one spoke much anymore. Some sharpened their blades. Some strapped their armor tighter. Some sat quietly beside wounded friends. Priests walked among the small groups, hearing confessions, praying for the living as if they were already dead. Sarmiento continued to inspect the lines. A good commander can't perform miracles. He couldn't turn 600 or 800 able-bodied men back into the original 3,500. He certainly couldn't turn 3,500 into 50,000. But he could do one last thing. Keep them standing firm until the bitter end. The dawn of August 6, 1539. The final assault began. Ottoman cannons unleashed a ferocious barrage. Wall sections already weakened by weeks of bombardment now caved in chunks. Stone cascaded down like waterfalls. Gun smoke, pinned low by the rain, swirled across the ground, turning the entire battlefield into a blinding, suffocating cauldron. Then the drums thundered. The Ottomans attacked from multiple directions. This wasn't a probing attack. This wasn't a skirmish. This was the killing blow. The Spanish fired their last shots. Some guns misfired. Some matches fizzled out. Some cannons fired once with no powder left to reload. As the defensive firepower died down, the Ottomans closed in faster. They flooded through the breaches, scrambled over the mounds of rubble, poured into the streets. From that second on, Castelnuovo was no longer a besieged fortress. It was a battlefield inside every single house. The Spanish fell back in groups. Not in a panicked rout. They retreated to pre-planned positions, turning every intersection into a choke point. One group held an alleyway. One group held a staircase. One group held the church doors. One group manned a stockpile of loose masonry to hurl down on climbers. The Ottomans had vastly superior numbers, but in the cramped streets, they still had to squeeze together. The men in back pushed the men in front. The men in front, skewered by pikes, couldn't retreat because the whole formation was shoving them forward. Screams echoed between the stone walls. In some places, blood slicked the steps so badly that soldiers slipped and piled on top of one another. In some places, a doorway was so jammed with corpses that the men behind had to climb over the dead just to keep fighting. The Spanish were barely shooting anymore. They were fighting hand to hand. One Tercio soldier used his pike to hold off 3 men at the mouth of an alley. When the pike snapped, he drew his sword. When his shoulder was slashed open, he still used his own body to block the path so the men behind him had a few more seconds to reload. An artilleryman, out of cannon fire, grabbed the iron pry bar used for the cannon wheels and smashed it into the skull of the first Ottoman through the door. A wounded man lying on the ground saw Ottomans run past and drove his dagger into an enemy's leg before being butchered. Sarmiento tried to hold the final line. He realized the upper tiers could no longer be held. He ordered a retreat to the lower fortress, where they could mount one last defense. This is the moment that opens the video. The survivors fell back, fighting every step of the way. Some turned to act as the rearguard and never came back. Some wounded were dragged along, only to be abandoned when the Ottomans closed the gap too fast. Sarmiento rode his horse through the chaos, desperately maintaining order. He refused to let the ranks break. He knew if they ran, they would die like a mob. If they retreated in good order, at least they could take down a few more of the enemy. Finally, the surviving group reached the lower fortress, only to find the gate sealed shut. That was the moment of destiny. Perhaps in just a few seconds, everyone understood. There were no more plans, there was no more rear guard, there was no final place to hold out. The men inside dropped a rope for Sarmiento. He refused it. His words were passed down, their spirit crystal clear. He would not be saved while his men were left behind. And so he turned back to the soldiers who were left. No need for a long speech. No need for promises of victory. All promises were meaningless now. They had only one thing left to do. Stand shoulder to shoulder. Face the Ottoman army, and fight until no one was left swinging. The final death struggle played out at point-blank range. Sarmiento was wounded. Some records say he was struck by multiple arrows, yet he kept commanding. The remaining officers, like Machen de Munguia, Juan Vizcaino, Sancho Frias, fought by his side. One by one, they fell. There was no more pushing the Ottomans back, only delaying them. In the end, numbers decided everything. No army can indefinitely use a few hundred men to hold off tens of thousands, especially when they are exhausted, out of ammo, out of water, bleeding, and surrounded on all sides. Castelnuovo fell. Francisco de Sarmiento died in the battle. Almost the entire garrison was annihilated. A tiny fraction were taken alive, mostly because they were too wounded to fight. The battle was over. But the cost of it would be remembered long after. The siege of Castelnuovo makes one thing abundantly clear about 16th century warfare. Numbers matter. They matter a lot. 50,000 men ultimately beat 3,500. No amount of bravery can fully replace food, ammunition, artillery, and reinforcements. But this battle also proves that numbers don't always tell the whole story. If those 50,000 men had met the 3,500 out on an open field, the battle might have ended very quickly. But when those 3,500 men stand behind stone walls, backed by discipline, iron-willed commanders, combat experience, and most importantly, the acceptance that there is no way out, they can make a colossal army pay a horrifying price. That is the essence of Castelnuovo. It isn't a fairy tale of the few defeating the many. It is a much grimmer story. The few cannot defeat the many, but the few can make the many bleed. Every day Castelnuovo held out, Barbarossa lost more men. Every failed charge drained Ottoman morale. Every breach plugged by the 3,500 defenders proved they wouldn't be crushed by numbers alone. And it's exactly that disparity that makes the battle so haunting. If the two sides were evenly matched, it would just be another fierce siege. But 3,500 against 50,000 is different. It confronts the viewer with a very simple question. If you know for an absolute certainty that you cannot win, how hard are you still willing to fight? For the Spanish soldiers at Castelnuovo, the answer was, until no one is left standing. After this battle, Castelnuovo remained in Ottoman hands. The Holy League's attempt to seize the initiative in the Eastern Mediterranean effectively collapsed. Barbarossa continued to be the name that struck terror across the seas. Suleiman remained one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. As for the soldiers in the fortress, most had no individual graves, no monuments raised for them at the time, no victory to go home and brag about. But they had something else: memory. The poems, the stories, the chronicles written long after spoke of them as men who turned death into honor. And perhaps that is why, more than 400 years later, the Battle of Castelnuovo is still being told. Because it is not just a story of a fallen fortress. It is the story of the exact moment a tiny group of men stood before a massive army and said, "If you want to pass, you'll have to step over our dead bodies." 3,500 men. 50,000 Ottoman soldiers. Over 200 warships. Nearly 20 days of siege. A fortress with no reinforcements. A battle with no retreat. And an ending that was predetermined from the very start. But it is precisely because the ending was predetermined that their choice became unforgettable. Castelnuovo did not survive. But its legend did.